Shameful, shameful 4x3 slides. Cool. So my talking is called Remote Working, Why You Should or Shouldn't Embrace It. All right, let's try that again. Maybe this would be better called How to Do Remote Properly and When Not to Bother. Cool. So, unlike the last 3 times I've given this talk, I probably actually don't need to introduce myself. But I work for a company called Automatic, where I hire software engineers. Automatic, you may or may not know, it's kind of a different crowd for this talk, but it's the company behind WordPress.com, Jetpack, WooCommerce, Longreads, Gravatar, bunch of stuff. It is a company of 865 of us in 68 countries, speaking 84 languages. We've been fully distributed since day one, about 14 years ago. So I guess up front here, what's the difference between remote and distributed? So for purposes of this talk, what we'll say is that in a remote setting, there's an office, but at least one person works somewhere else. In a distributed setting, there's no office, so everybody works somewhere else. For the purposes of this talk, they're kind of the same thing. So whenever I refer to remote working, then I'm also talking about distributed as well. So what's so great about working remotely? Or if you're an employer, what is so great about employing remote people? So for argument's sake, let's say that all developers go to Stack Overflow, right? Like a little Control-C, Control-V type action. Nobody? Just me? Okay, cool. Let's say for argument's sake, if all developers were to go to Stack Overflow, and you are a typical employer and you're looking to hire people in the US only, right? So out of the 20 million professional developers every month that visit Stack Overflow, 77% of them are from outside the US. So that's a large number of developers you're excluding. So I like this quote quite a bit. Talent is equally distributed around the world, but opportunity is not. So by offering remote working or by being open to remote working yourself, you are embracing the opportunity that remote working brings. So let's clarify a little bit here what we are and what we aren't talking about. So remote is not just about working from home in your pajamas, which I won't lie to you is a significant perk, but it's not just about that. It's more about flexibility. So the flexibility for people with family commitments, with educational commitments, with disabilities, with whatever, to be able to contribute meaningfully without needing to be present at a particular place and time. On the other hand, remote working is not easy. It is incredibly easy to do badly, but it's difficult to do well. It takes a lot of hard work and commitment to pull it off successfully. However, it is worth it, just in terms of the increased opportunity that it brings, but on both sides of the employer-employee kind of spectrum. So Automatic has been doing this for a while, so we have some tips for you. The first one is to act as though everybody is remote. The second that you have a meeting where you have 9 people in an office and you have 1 person on Zoom, you've created 2 groups of people. It's far more inclusive if you put everybody on Zoom. Regardless of how silly or forced it might seem, you pretty much have to do things this way in order to do things more inclusively. Another one is to default to asynchronous communication. If you let go of the idea that everybody has to be available right now when you need to talk to them, you give your people permission to use the flexibility that remote working brings. one thing that makes asynchronous communication work is documentation. So at Automatic, we're quite into open source, and documentation is kind of a foundational principle of that. But too often documentation is written after the fact and only about the end state. On the other hand, we document everything from the initial idea through all of the discussion, all of the ideas, all the dead ends, all the bugs, all the fixes, all the way to the end state. So what our documentation has is context, and context is something that is far too often locked up in somebody's head. And you do need to be quite intentional about building a culture. When you're remote, there's no such thing as running into the CEO in the break room or going out for spontaneous drinks after work. You need to give your people permission to socialize and to have fun, and to create a shared identity. And then finally, it's important to get together at least occasionally in person. So at Automatic, we get together in teams twice a year, and then we have an all-company get-together once a year. And doing this helps you work together in a really kind of accelerated way. And not only that, to build and cement bonds that carry you through the rest of the year. Working remotely from people can be tough, and it's these shared experiences that help us get through that. There are some don'ts. The biggest one of all is do not exclude people from work conversations. Do not have work conversations on the phone, in person, in a DM, unless you are going to record it and make it publicly available to the people that need to at some point. There's nothing that kills morale like having a week's worth of work knocked out because you weren't present for a single conversation. And I speak from bitter experience. Don't assume, seems dumb, but I'm not assuming that you know not to assume. So communication is pretty key. Not assuming is a key part of communication. Don't hold people at 9 to 5. If you give people the flexibility of remote working, but then you insist on particular hours, you didn't really give them that flexibility. Trust your people. And then don't treat it as an experiment. Don't half-ass it. Let your people trust you that you're not going to pull the rug out from under them and take away this flexibility. So, when not to bother? Ultimately, remote isn't for everybody. Some companies don't have the time or the ability to commit. This isn't a process that you can do overnight. I mean, if you're founding a company and you're starting out remote, then great. But if you're transitioning, it takes some time, and it's a process. And if you're in a hurry to deliver, maybe you don't have that. From an individual perspective, you need to ask yourself if you'd be suited to remote work. Some people need the structure of an office and a commute. Some people need to be around other people. For some people, working from home is unhealthy, and it's not for them. So it requires a bit of self-awareness to know if you're one of those people. Another thing to consider is that when you're onboarding somebody into a remote company, you're often not only onboarding that person into your company, but also into remote work as well. So it increases the complexity. If you look at your turnover inside the first year to maybe identify whether you have an existing onboarding problem, maybe you need to fix that before you think about remote work as well. And then junior developers ramp up that complexity even higher. So you're onboarding people into your company, into remote work, and then into being a developer in the first place. Super advanced, not for the unwary. So, going back to my original title. You should embrace remote working if you're looking to expand your options past those that are in your immediate area. You should embrace remote if you are aware of what it takes to succeed and you're committed to doing it. And you should embrace remote if it's a fit for your values, your circumstances, and your needs. And with that, that's my cat. Questions? Oh, there are questions. Well, all right.
Hello. Excellent. I have a question about your documentation.
Yes.
I love the idea of having a lot of context, because you're right, that's usually missing. But I also get the impression, especially for projects that have been going on for a while, that your documentation is really heavy and hard going, because there'd be so many stops and starts and things that went off nowhere, and you'd have to read through all of that. Have you ever had issues with that? Do people have issues with that at Automatic?
So there's some of the, okay, so I have to sort of explain the way that we structure things. So we use blogs for this, big surprise, because it's the WordPress company, right? It's a particular blog theme called P2, and it's basically threaded inline comments with tagging. So we tend to have a blog that is for a particular team, and then an individual post would be for the project, and then all of the comments are where you get the context from. So basically one post might say, I'm going to build this feature, and then all of the comments are where the context is. That plus Elasticsearch to be able to find the relevant bits immediately or why it works. Yes, it gets lengthy and involved sometimes, but if it's a product that or a feature that we launched, 2 years ago, you wouldn't go back to the original conception thread and then put a comment right at the very bottom. It'd be more like, okay, we've launched this thing, let's close this off. Everything else is then a new discussion.
Thanks.
So the having everyone in the office is awesome for culture, and having everyone remote is awesome for culture. You get that kind of weird middle ground where you have some people in the office, but you've got maybe one person remote or a few remote. What's kind of a good way of making those steps and making them more seamless and less jarring with being the one person out of the room kind of thing?
Yeah, I think I'll tell you one thing that I think is not good, and I kind of touched on it in my talk, is having a big screen that everybody stands around except for the people who aren't in the office. I think that doesn't work. I think if you want to be inclusive about things, you put everybody on a level footing. The other thing is to on a whole team kind of basis, let go of the idea that somebody needs to be available right now. If the team culture is, hey, let's drop everything and talk about this thing, let's be available at the drop of a hat, let's all be strictly 9 to 5, that sort of thing, then people don't have the latitude to be able to use that flexibility. So I think in order to make that team feel a bit more cohesive would be basically, like I said, just to act as though everybody is remote.
I'm just thinking about when people are in the office and working together, and also when people are working remotely. And when you're in the office, sometimes you'll have tools that aid with your communication, like you'll draw things up on the whiteboard, or you might get a pad and pen out to explain some design or some concepts. So one question is, are there some tools that you found helpful that kind of help replace that? And the other thought I had was that when people are working remotely, quite often someone might have a dodgy internet connection or something like that. So do you have specific rules around you must have this kind of bandwidth or anything like that to make sure that everyone is able to communicate properly?
Yep. All right, so second part first. there's luckily not a huge amount of bandwidth that's needed for us because we do very little video. Like I have about an hour a week of video and that's it. Everything else is Slack and, Git basically. So there's not a lot of bandwidth that's needed, but it's for people that are in countries where internet is less reliable, it's not unusual for them to sort of have to go, oh, crap, my internet's out, I'm going to go to a cafe and log in, that sort of thing. We don't have requirements around that stuff, but, you need the internet to do your job. On the other bit, I don't think there's, so we are not terribly prescriptive about what tools people use for anything. Everybody has complete autonomy to use whatever they want. So there's a whole bunch of different tools that are in use. So there's virtual whiteboards and people, putting squiggles into Google Docs and people sharing screens and all kinds of stuff. I don't think there's anything that is such a killer app for that it's been broadly adopted across the whole company. No, nothing I can think of.
Well, thank you.
Question about the trust. How do you identify underperforming employees?
So feedback. Part of the trust thing, I think, is not being able to necessarily identify that stuff immediately. Part of trust is letting that surface over time. All of our performance rating and assessments is done via feedback. That's it. We have no measurements around hours spent, lines of code, any of that stuff. It's purely by feedback. That said, though, I think that's probably like a pretty solid way to go about things. If somebody's not doing the job, then their teammates and their lead are going to be the first people to know about it. So that's how you find out, basically.
Hi. I've noticed working from home that certain things really help your productivity, like keeping a separate computer for work from a computer for your personal stuff. Do you have any tips on how you set up your home office for like maximum productivity?
I am the wrong person to ask about this because my desk, literally, this is my desk here, and like Dave is about where my bed is. My house sucks. I so want to move. Don't work in your bedroom. Work in an office with a door you can shut, so when your kids come home from school, they don't appear on your video calls every single day. Definitely having a desk that you only use for work purposes. It doesn't necessarily have to be a computer that you only use for work purposes, but having a space where you sit down and you are working. That said, though, get away from that space as much as possible. I tend to go work in a cafe for a couple hours, probably every second or third day. And there's an immediate boost in productivity as soon as I sit down in a new space and just get settled in and start working.
Thanks. Hi. Okay, I'm going to bring up a possibly dirty word, agile. I've found that the most mature teams that I've been able to coach myself have been able to, they work best and most collaboratively when they're pairing or when they're discussing ideas and they're able to come up with creative, innovative ideas, or they're just even just listening to background conversations like, oh, I've got an idea, and then they chime in. That's obviously a lot more of a challenge remotely. Are there reasonable workarounds? Is it partially just a trade-off?
There isn't really replacing the serendipity of overheard conversations. There just isn't. You can compensate for it though by being a bit more disciplined about having like Slack conversations in the open. And when you're all distributed, you're sort of forced to, otherwise you speak to nobody. But having conversations in a public forum where they can be overheard is still replicable. It's still you don't have the same level of just idle chit chat and overheard conversations that you would, but you can replicate it.
Any more questions?
Yep.
How do you do the junior program there?
We don't. I want to. It's on my long-term plan, but right now we cannot. We just can't do it. Or rather, we've never figured out how. No. I'm going to be badgering Ryan. I mean, / engaging Ryan as a consultant.
Great talk. Thank you very much. What is the name of your cat?
Scarlet.
Ah, it's adorable. What's going to be adorable?
What's going to be named Scully, as in like the X-Files, and then my daughter overheard it as Scarlet, and that's what she got called.
Any tips on how you prevent yourself from overworking when doing remotes?
When I work it out, I'll tell you. I always thought that I would be poorly suited to remote because I would do that thing where, like, you look up and it's 8 p.m. And if not for my family, I would do that all the time. They're pretty good about being like, "Are you off the clock yet?" So, yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. It's an occupational hazard.
That pretty much answers what I was going to ask. I was just going to say that, like, I stopped taking my work laptop home from here because it just eats into my time, and so I had to draw a line. And I'm just wondering, like, you know, obviously you struggled with that, I assume, yeah.
Especially when you're globally distributed, and no matter what the hour, somebody is just starting their day. So Slack goes off all the time. And it's like, well, I could handle this, but I'm not going to because it's 10 o'clock and I should be relaxing.
Hey, I was just wondering, from a perspective of a junior dev, and obviously you can't really jump straight into remote working, but I was just wondering what you would recommend if that was a very attractive type of working arrangement, and whether or not you should stay at a company that has no ambition for it, or whether you should start sourcing companies that are open to it to begin with.
That's a good question. There's probably two different ways to go in that scenario. One being to stick with that company that's not going to do remote, you know, for a little while, so you can build some experience and get that on your resume, and then start looking around at the sort of mid-level. I guess the other option would be to keep looking for that company that's going to allow that. Maybe don't go all or nothing to begin with, though. Maybe start looking for some place that will allow some level of remote, even if that is like 1 day a week. You know, just get your foot in that door, and then start building trust over time, and then hopefully expanding that one day. I think we'll just take one more because people are starting to drool a little bit.
So I'll try and make it quick because I know I'm standing between everyone and pizza. But I'm working for a company that's transitioning to remote. So we had an official policy that was brought in at the start of the year saying that we can now work remote up to 2 days a week as per your arrangement with your manager. What I'm finding, and I think you raised with documentation, awesome point. I think it is a great way to empower teams and to be able to promote that flexibility. What I also know is that my teammates are not the biggest fans of having to write a lot of documentation, and it's probably at the bottom of their list of things they'd like to spend their day doing. How do you promote a culture of documentation and documentation first, I guess?
That's a really good. It's kind of a chicken and the egg kind of thing. At Automatic, the culture is documentation, and that's like when you come in, it's like we document everything here. So having to institute that culture in the first place, that's a good question. Setting the example probably is the thing that springs to mind. And also badgering the living shit out of people that refuse to document for context so that they eventually get the shits and write it down.
Let's hear it for Toby. Thank you so much. That was amazing.
Thank you.